There was a time when Steve Jobs called the idea of the iPhone the dumbest idea he'd ever heard. He stood on stage and mocked the exact features that would later define it. At almost every point where Jobs drew the line, it was Tim Cook who ended up on the other side to prove him wrong. A small group of engineers approached Steve Jobs with an idea. Apple's iPod was the most successful product the company had ever made, the device that had pulled Apple back from the edge of irrelevance. The engineers wanted to take that success and put a phone inside it. And he reacted by asking why anyone would want to cannibalize the one product actually making the company money before calling the entire idea the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. It took roughly 6 months of persuasion, led by iPod engineering chief Tony Fadell, before Jobs even agreed to seriously consider it. And according to Adam Grant's account in Think Again, what eventually changed his mind was something closer to Jobs' own competitive instincts being turned against him. Because his team argued how stunning an Apple-designed phone could look next to anything else on the market, and they warned him that if Apple didn't build one, Microsoft eventually would, and would own the category by default. Jobs could tolerate risking the iPod's revenue, but he couldn't tolerate the idea of Microsoft getting somewhere first. Even once Jobs was convinced the iPhone should exist, he remained deeply skeptical of who it was actually for. Because when the concept of a broader smartphone category first came up internally, Jobs dismissed the entire segment as a device built for what he called the pocket protector crowd. In Jobs' mind, ordinary consumers, the people who bought iPods to listen to music on the way to work, had no interest in carrying around a miniature computer that made phone calls on the side. And that assumption turned out to be almost exactly backwards. Because once Tim Cook took over and spent more than a decade scaling the iPhone into the most universal consumer object on the planet, Apple ended up reporting more than 1 billion active iPhone users worldwide, spanning from teenagers to grandparents, almost none of whom would recognize themselves in Jobs' description of a pocket protector. The device Jobs feared was too niche for mainstream consumers became the single most mainstream consumer product of the century, precisely because Cook built the manufacturing scale and the global retail footprint to put one in the hands of nearly 1/5 of the planet. But while Jobs did have doubts, he eventually became the iPhone's biggest believer. But that didn't mean he stopped drawing lines on how the iPhone should be or look. Take the screen size, for example. At the iPhone's original unveiling in January 2007, Jobs insisted the 3.5-inch display was deliberately sized so a thumb could reach every corner of the screen without adjusting your grip. And for years, that stayed a company belief. And then in July 2010, in the middle of a press conference addressing the iPhone 4's antenna problems, a reporter asked whether Apple might build something bigger to compete with the growing wave of large-screen Android phones. And Jobs didn't hesitate, comparing oversized rivals to Hummers. He said plainly that, "You can't get your hand around it, no one is going to buy that." And people bought into that. But in September 2014, Tim Cook stood on stage to unveil the iPhone 6, which had a 4.7-inch display, and new model, the iPhone 6 Plus, at a massive 5.5 inches by the standards of the time. Wall Street analysts started calling the resulting sales wave a supercycle, and it became, by units sold, the best-selling iPhone generation Apple had ever produced. And it permanently reset what the entire industry considered a normal phone size. The device Jobs said nobody would buy became the template every flagship phone on Earth has followed ever since. And while this was the case, Tim Cook's team did experiment with the smaller phones again. Because in 2020, Apple released the iPhone 12 mini, a genuinely smaller phone built for exactly the customers who'd never stopped wanting one, with a screen size of 5.4 inches. Closer to Jobs' original philosophy than anything Apple had sold in years, in comparison to the 6.1 inches of the base iPhone 12. A small section of people loved it, but most did not, and within the first couple of months on sale, the Mini reportedly accounted for only around 6% of all iPhone 12 sales, and Apple slashed production by as much as 70% heading into the following year. Apple tried again with the iPhone 13 mini in 2021, priced only about $100 below the standard model, and watched it sell even worse than its predecessor. and by 2023, the mini line was gone entirely. And Steve Jobs' instinct that a phone shouldn't get too big for one hand turned out to be wrong for the mainstream market Cook was building. A second example is the stylus. At the same 2007 keynote where he unveiled the iPhone, Jobs spent a full minute mocking the styluses bundled with competing smartphones, joking that you have to get them out, put them away, and inevitably lose them before saying, "Who wants a stylus?" It became one of the most quoted lines of the entire keynote. But what Jobs didn't mention was that Fidel's engineering team had built stylus support into the prototype anyway and left it there, specifically disobeying the direction Jobs had given. And in 2015, Tim Cook unveiled the Apple Pencil, a precision stylus built specifically for the iPad Pro. But to be fair to Jobs, he was making a point about a phone's primary input method, not ruling out styluses everywhere. And a tiny plastic stick was never going to beat a fingertip on a device you would use with one hand. But Cook saw something Jobs didn't, which was turning Apple's touch devices into serious tools for artists and illustrators required exactly the kind of high-precision input Jobs publicly humiliated an entire product category for offering. And then there's the App Store, because unlike the screen size or the stylus, this one happened almost entirely without Tim Cook. When the iPhone launched, there was no App Store at all, and Steve Jobs told the developers a solution to give access to the iPhone. And the solution turned out to be writing web apps through Safari using Ajax and what the industry called Web 2.0 technology, requiring no software development kit or SDK. He actively resisted opening up a native SDK, worried that letting outside code run directly on the iPhone would introduce instability and a flood of low-quality software Apple had no time to manage. An Apple board member, Art Levinson, reportedly phoned Jobs about it many times specifically to push back on that stance, and marketing chief Phil Schiller pushed the same case internally. Jobs held out for months before finally relenting, and the App Store launched in July 2008 with about 500 apps. And in the Tim Cook era, that afterthought became the financial power of the entire company, because Apple's services division, built substantially around the App Store's commission structure alongside iCloud and other subscriptions, now generates over $100 billion a year, a business which Jobs conceded existed almost as a grudging compromise. Because the iPhone's real dominance, the thing that actually keeps a billion people locked into the ecosystem year after year, turned out to be the third-party developer economy Jobs spent in 2007 actively trying to prevent. And then there's the deal that made almost everything else possible, which was control over the carriers. Before the iPhone, mobile networks like Verizon and Singular held every card, forcing manufacturers to slap carrier logos on phones and preload them with bloatware nobody wanted. And Jobs hated that arrangement enough to negotiate one of the most unusual contracts in telecom history, meeting Singular executives in a secretive hotel room in Manhattan in February 2005, telling them Apple's technology was light years ahead of anything the industry had produced, and getting the carrier to agree to distribute a phone they weren't even permitted to see beforehand, in exchange for roughly 5 years of exclusivity and a cut of the monthly bill. Apple kept total control over the hardware, the software, and the branding. He won the control, but Tim Cook was the one who turned that leverage into global reach. As a career supply chain and partnership specialist, Cook spent years replicating and scaling that same template of carrier subsidy deals across dozens of countries. And the biggest prize took 6 years of on and off negotiation to land an agreement with China Mobile, the largest wireless carrier on the planet, with more than 600 million subscribers. The deal finally closed in December 2013, and the iPhone went on sale across China Mobile's network the following January, opening up a market Apple had been locked out of since the very first iPhone shipped. And Cook didn't stop at negotiating with carriers. He eventually started removing the last physical piece of leverage they had left. Starting with the iPhone 14 in 2022, US models shipped with no physical SIM tray at all, running entirely on the embedded eSIM technology Apple had supported since 2018. And by the iPhone 17 generation in 2025, that same eSIM-only approach had spread to a dozen countries, and the ultra-thin iPhone Air became the first model ever sold with no SIM tray anywhere in the world. A SIM card used to be the carrier's foothold inside Apple's device. Cook engineered a phone where that foothold no longer physically exists. Put all of it side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge that has nothing to do with Jobs simply being wrong and everything to do with what each man was actually good at. Jobs drawing certain lines weren't failures of his vision. They were the scaffolding and unproven product needed to survive. And Cook simply discovered which parts of that could improve the iPhone.